Hello and welcome to another Oppenheimer video. I know it's the third one, but I made the previous video maybe a day or two after seeing the movie for the first time. So I was super hyped up, and now that I've seen it for a second time and I've had a little bit of time to think, I'd like to talk a little bit about it more. It would also be nice to touch on some of the other characters because I've spoken about Opje himself at length. But before we get there, als jy Nederlandstalig bent, miskien vond jy het raar dat Opje zijn Nederlands klonk meer zoals Duits. So there was this fun confusion online because during the scene of Opje giving the speech in Leiden, nobody could understand what he was saying. He was meant to be speaking Dutch during that scene, but Dutch-speaking people couldn't understand a word of it. They thought that he was speaking German, and the Germans were like, no, that's not German. So what language was he actually speaking? I found this really great TikTok that explains it so well, and if you are Dutch or Flemish speaking, trust me, this is really cool.
Bij de botsing tussen een alpha-deeltje en een atoom.
Bij de botsing tussen een alpha-deeltje en een atoom, so when an alpha part and an atom collide.
Aangevoerd verschillende energieën, de verbinding is Oppenheimer in de relatieve translatie. What's he saying?
En dit is het lastige, iets met veranderen de energieën, met name bla bla bla, relatieve translatie.
So yeah, that settles that. Also, keep in mind that Nolan himself said that he did remove random parts of the speech to cut down on the runtime of the movie. This was one of those scenes that had to be cut. So even if Cillian Murphy was speaking in a Dutch or Flemish accent, it would still be really difficult to understand him anyway. So let's start with one of my least favorite parts of the movie, Jean Tatlock. It's clear from the movie that she is troubled, and it's noted in the book that she suffered terrible depressions. Opje would often try to work through it with her, and according to the book, Jean was Robert's truest love. He loved her more than most. He was devoted to her, and he even stopped seeing the almost half a dozen women that he was seeing at the time when Jean came into the picture. When things were going terribly for Jean, Robert would become depressed as well. Anyway, theirs was a stormy 3-year relationship with Jean rejecting several of Robert's marriage proposals. Bob Serber claimed that Jean went through phases where she would just disappear for weeks, months sometimes, and then she would taunt Robert mercilessly. She'd taunt him about who she'd been with and what they'd been doing. She seemed determined to hurt him, perhaps because she knew Robert loved her so much. The way that she's portrayed in the movie, if it weren't for the fact that Robert's association with her increased the suspicion of his never-proven Communist Party ties, I wouldn't really find her that compelling a character. I know there wasn't really time to go into depth about their relationship, and I don't think that that was really necessary, but the impact that she had on him outside of the communist stuff wasn't that really big in the movie. I also think that the choice to have Florence Pugh play her wasn't great, and I think I would have liked it to go to a lesser-known actor. And, I mean, to be fair, she's not the only one I felt this way about in the movie. Anyway, I don't know if it was to maybe give the character a little bit more gravitas or importance in the movie, but Nolan made the worst possible decision then by having Robert read his Destroyer of Worlds quote to her in that sex scene. I didn't know much about Oppenheimer before reading the book or watching the movie, but I did know that quote. And Robert said in an interview that he thought of that quote when he was watching the Trinity test explosion. I mean, I'm glad that Nolan still included it there too, but I don't know. In the sex scene with Jean, I felt like it kind of cheapened what was supposed to be an iconic moment. Speaking of kind of sex scenes, when I first watched the scene with Robert naked in the testimony room and Jean straddling him, I hated it. But I guess I get that the discomfort of it, seeing him exposed, the questioning about his relationship with her, the indignity of it all, and Kitty's humiliation, that was the point. I actually liked that it was jarring and uncomfortable. By the way, it's clear that Jean was an intellectual match in a lot of ways to Robert, but she was also really accomplished. By June 1941, she had a medical degree from Stanford University School of Medicine. She spent the year 1941 to 42 as an intern at the St. Elizabeth's Psychiatric Hospital in Washington, D.C., and the following year, she was a resident physician at Mount Zion Hospital in San Francisco. Also, even through their ups and downs, Robert's circle of friends really liked Jean. The opposite was true for Kitty, who many found manipulative. Jackie Oppenheimer, Frank's wife, remember Frank is Robert's younger brother, openly vented her animosity, saying that Kitty was a schemer. If Kitty wanted anything, she would always get it. She was a phony. All her political convictions were phony. All her ideas were borrowed. Honestly, she's one of the few really evil people I've known in my life. But it was also true that she had a stabilizing influence on Robert's life. Her career, Serber said, was advancing Robert's career, which was the overwhelming controlling influence on her. By the way, there were some of Robert's friends who even snubbed Kitty at first and hoped that he would reconcile with Jean. Kitty also kind of undersold her highborn heritage with her "I came from money" comment in the movie. Kitty was related on her mother's side to all the crowned heads of Europe, recalled Robert Serber. When she was a girl, she used to spend her summers visiting her uncle, the King of the Belgians. Kitty had been born on August 8, 1910, in Recklinghausen, a small town in North Rhine-Westphalia, Germany. She had come to America 2 years later. An only child, Kitty led a privileged childhood, growing up in the wealthy Pittsburgh suburb of Aspinwall. She later told friends that her father was prince of a small principality in Westphalia and her mother was related to Queen Victoria. As a young woman, Kitty occasionally let it be known that she came from a noble family. Friends of the family recall her receiving letters from her German relatives addressed to Her Highness Catherine. Her first language was not English, and even later in life, she could speak a beautiful High German. When I read this description, do you know who I immediately thought of as Kitty? Diane Kruger. I'd love to hear her speak in High German, even though Kitty was described as a petite brunette. In the end, though, Emily Blunt was perfect as Kitty. I mean, it's a pity that she'd never quite took to motherhood, but her troubled life with her alcohol issues, her vulnerability, but still being the stabilizing force for Robert, was pretty accurately portrayed. Now onto something that I haven't spoken about much, Edward Teller and the Super. First of all, I actually have his memoir and I cannot wait to get into it. I might do a video on that. He's a deeply fascinating figure and there's so much more there. Right, so after Edward Teller presents his findings to the team at Los Alamos about the super and the possibility of the atmosphere being ignited, the movie shows Oppia going to Albert Einstein to seek advice. This is one of my favorite departures from the book, and I thoroughly enjoyed all of Robert and Einstein's scenes together. In the book, Robert doesn't seek out Einstein, but he goes to a professor, Carl T. Compton, a professor of physics at Princeton University. Compton's answer was pretty decisive. Was there really any chance that an atom bomb would trigger the explosion of the nitrogen in the atmosphere, of the hydrogen in the ocean? Better to accept the slavery of the Nazis than to run the chance of drawing the final curtain on mankind. Better soon ran further calculations, as we know, that convinced both Teller and Oppenheimer of the near zero possibility of igniting the atmosphere. When I'd initially read the book, the rivalry between Bethe and Teller wasn't really something that stood out so much. There were so many physicists named in the book, and I was more interested in the ones that I'd actually heard about, like Bohr, Heisenberg, and Einstein. Anyway, I enjoyed Bethe and Teller's characters so much in the movie that I went back and reread those parts in American Prometheus. Teller was bored by the work at hand, and he wanted to work on his H-bomb calculations instead. He was combative towards his boss Bethe, and a lot of this was because whenever Teller would come up with new ideas on how to make the H-bomb work, Bethe would work to disprove those theories. Anyway, as we know, instead of firing him, Oppia gave Teller what he wanted, but Teller was still bothered by the fact that Oppia was becoming a politician. Around 1949, Teller was still trying to recruit scientists to get them to return to Los Alamos to work on the super. This is around the time that Oppia was being quite outspoken about his concerns. Teller even wrote that Hans Bethe was considering a return to Los Alamos to work on the super full time. But Bethe was actually undecided at the time. This was until he had a long conversation with his friend Victor Weisskopf, who argued that a war fought with thermonuclear weapons would be suicidal. We both had to agree, Bethe said, that after such a war, even if we were to win it, the world would not be like the world we want to preserve. We would lose the things we were fighting for. This was a very long conversation and a very difficult one for both of us. A few days later, Bethe phoned Teller and told him of his decision. He was disappointed, Bethe recalled. I was relieved. Yet, despite Weisskopf's pivotal role, Teller was convinced that Oppenheimer was responsible for Bethe's decision not to take the job. After the GAC, of which Oppia and Rabe were members, report concluded that the hydrogen bomb would not be in their best interest to pursue, Oppia thought that the matter was settled. But Teller, Strauss, and other supporters of the hydrogen bomb were mounting a counteroffensive. By the way, the GAC was a general advisory committee to assist the AEC commissioners. Truman was also intrigued by the idea of the super, and on January 31st, 1950, in a meeting with Truman to discuss the super, David Lilienthal was giving a presentation and Truman cut him off and just asked, Can the Russians do it? When everybody nodded, Truman said, well, in that case, we have no choice. We'll go ahead with the super. Lilienthal noted in his diary that Truman had clearly set on what he was going to do before he even set foot into the meeting. Some months earlier, Lilienthal had warned Truman demagogues in Congress would attempt to force his hand on the super. Truman's weaselly character in the movie was so spot on, and of course he would support the super. Even still, with the president's endorsement, Borden, Strauss, and Teller saw Oppia as an obstacle. And in 1951, Teller had gone to the FBI with a laundry list of accusations against Oppenheimer. The general theme of his charges was that Oppenheimer had delayed or attempted to delay or hinder the development of the H-bomb. Interviewed at Los Alamos, Teller did his best to smear Oppenheimer by innuendo, telling the FBI that a lot of people believed Oppenheimer opposed the development of the H-bomb on direct orders from Moscow. To cover himself, he then said that he did not think that Oppia was disloyal. Instead, he attributed Oppenheimer's behavior to a personality defect. Oppenheimer was a very complicated person. In late April 1953, Borden visited Strauss's office to discuss their mutual concerns about Oppia. Borden gave Strauss a mystery document, probably a compilation of Borden's suspicions about Oppenheimer. This document has never surfaced, but their subsequent activities suggest that during this meeting, they agreed on a plan, a conspiracy really, to end Oppenheimer's influence. Borden would do the dirty work, and Strauss would provide him access to the information that he needed. Teller was also working hard behind the scenes with Borden to undermine Oppia's influence and to fuel Borden's suspicions about Oppia. In conclusion, Teller said that he would do anything possible to see that Oppenheimer's services to the government were terminated. So yeah, the movie was actually kind of kind to Teller, but he was still one of the most interesting characters in it. Teller would pay dearly for all of this, as he became a pariah amongst his former friends and colleagues. And yeah, you can't blame Kitty for refusing to give him her hand. His actions actually went a lot further than what was shown in the movie. Anyway, another one of my favorite casting decisions was of Isidor Rabbi, Robert's close friend. They met in Leipzig and became lifelong friends. While he decided against working at Los Alamos, Rabbi became, as Hans Better puts it, a fatherly advisor to Oppia. I never went on the payroll at Los Alamos, Rabbi said. I refused to. I wanted to have my lines of communications clear. I was not a member of any of their important committees or anything of the sort, but just Oppenheimer's advisor. Oppia always trusted Rabbi, and I was so interested in the casting decision for this. I loved it. And I get why main characters were all A-listers. And they were all excellent, but I really didn't like Rami Malek or Florence Pugh in their roles. I don't know, sometimes having A-listers in these bit parts, they're just a little bit too recognizable. It feels a little bit gimmicky. On the other hand, you have actors like Dane DeHaan, this actor who played Rabbi, the one who played Hakan Chevalier, and all the scientists. They were perfectly cast because they look familiar, but they're not really household names as such. And so, yeah, I found them a little bit more believable, especially as secondary characters. It was also nice to see logician Kurt Gödel. He was the guy who was walking with Einstein. He was paranoid about his food being poisoned by the Germans. He was described as a painfully shy recluse who suffered from chronic malnutrition because of his severe paranoid depression. Einstein was his only friend. For most of his decades at the Institute, he was a solitary, ghostly figure, dressed in a shabby black winter coat, scribbling German shorthand into reams of notebooks. He's only on screen for a few seconds, but I don't know why he's made such a lasting impression. And as for Strauss, he would take his animosity for Oppia to the grave. So much like in the movie, he was nominated by President Eisenhower to be his commerce secretary, but he lost the confirmation. Supporters of Oppia did indeed lobby John F. Kennedy, who wasn't sure that he would go against the president who had nominated Strauss. But once he was briefed of Strauss's treatment of Oppia, he changed his vote to a no. By the way, did anybody else get kind of Tenet flashbacks during this scene? Anyway, yeah, that's it for part 2 of this video. I definitely need some practice at making videos that are not summaries because I find it kind of tricky to tie it all together in the end. But yeah. If you ever do find time in your life, do read American Prometheus. And if you have any thoughts, feel free to share, and thank you for watching.